Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the International Criminal Court, magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Today we reach the conclusion of this pre-trial hearing and it is my duty to deliver the closing statement on behalf of former President Rodrigo Duterte. Sa buong proseso ng investigation na ito, nakita natin ang maraming alegasyon at testimonya. Ngunit, sa kabila ng lahat ng ito, ang mahalaga ay ang prinsipyo ng due process. It is a cornerstone of justice, na kahit ang pinakamataas na opisyal ng isang bansa ay may karapatan sa patas na paglilitis. The evidence presented by the prosecution must be scrutinized carefully. Kailangan natin tingnan hindi lang ang mga salita at testimonya, kundi pati na rin ang konteksto at katotohanan sa likod nito. Throughout this pre-trial, there has been an attempt to portray the former president in the worst possible light. Ngunit hindi natin pwedeng kalimutan na ang leadership decisions he made were taken in the context of fighting crime, maintaining national security, at pagtugon sa mga krimen na nagpahirap sa ordinaryong mamamayan. We must also consider the principle of individual responsibility. Ang batas ay malinaw. Hindi maaaring managot ang isang leader sa aksyon ng iba kung walang malinaw na ebidensya na siya mismo ay nag-utos o kumikilos upang sadyang lumabag sa batas. The prosecution has failed to provide concrete proof na directly links President Duterte to intentional criminal actions. Moreover, it is important to remember the sovereignty of the Philippines. While the ICC has a role in upholding international law, we cannot ignore the mechanisms of justice already in place sa sariling bansa. Local courts, oversight bodies, and democratic processes exist to hold leaders accountable. President Duterte has always operated within the boundaries of the law as defined by our national legal system. In conclusion, ang mensahe namin sa hukuman ay simple. Do not let allegations and conjectures override the principles of justice. Ang bawat tao, regardless of position or status, deserves fairness, impartiality, and evidence-based judgment. President Duterte has cooperated fully throughout this pre-trial process at handa siyang harapin ang anumang legal na proseso, basta ito ay makatarungan at patas. We respectfully urge this court to uphold the principles of fairness and due process, to carefully consider the evidence, and to recognize that the allegations presented do not amount to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Let justice be guided not by politics, but by truth, law, and fairness. Maraming salamat po. The principle of due process is one of the most fundamental pillars of justice in any legal system, and it serves as the foundation upon which the entire concept of fairness rests. Sa konteksto ng pre-trial proceedings sa International Criminal Court laban kay dating Pangulong Rodrigo Duterte, ang kahalagahan ng due process ay higit na tumitindi. Due process ensures that every individual, regardless of status or political position, is entitled to a fair, impartial, and transparent evaluation of the allegations made against them. Ito ay hindi lamang isang legal na konsepto, kundi isang moral na obligasyon ng hukuman upang tiyakin na ang hustisya ay hindi lamang pahayag sa papel, kundi aktwal na naipatutupad sa praktikal na pamamaraan. Sa buong proseso ng pre-trial na ito, marami tayong nakita, maraming testimonya, alegasyon at dokumentong ipinakita bilang ebidensya. Ngunit ang central point ng closing statement ni Nicolas Kaufman ay malinaw. Hindi maaaring pahintulutan na ang opinyon, haka-haka o pampulitikang motibo ang maging batayan ng paghuhusga. The principle of due process protects individuals from arbitrary prosecution and ensures that legal proceedings are conducted according to established rules. Ang bawat testigo, bawat dokumento, at bawat aligasyon ay kailangang dumaan sa maingat na pagsusuri. At ang desisyon ng hukuman ay dapat ibatay sa malinaw na ebidensya, hindi lamang sa impresyon o propaganda. Kaugnay nito, ang pre-trial proceedings ay hindi lamang simpleng hakbang para sa paghahain ng kaso. Ito ay isang pagkakataon para ipakita ang katotohanan at para maipakita ang integridad ng legal na proseso. Sa ganitong paraan, ang due process ay nagsisilbing proteksyon hindi lamang para sa akusado, kundi pati na rin para sa buong sistemang legal. Kapag ang due process ay pinapabayaang maalis, nawawala ang tiwala ng publiko sa katarungan at nagiging instrumento ang hukuman sa politika sa halip na sa batas. Nicolas Kaufman, sa kanyang closing statement, ay malinaw na pinanatili ang mensaheng ito. Kahit na ang dating Pangulo ay nasa harap ng isang makapangyarihang internasyonal na hukuman, siya ay may karapatan sa parehong proteksyon na ibinibigay sa bawat ordinaryong mamamayan. Isa pang mahalagang aspeto ng due process ay ang principle of presumption of innocence. Sa ilalim ng batas, bawat akusado ay itinuturing na inosente hanggang sa mapatunayan ang kanyang kasalanan beyond a reasonable doubt. Sa kaso ni Duterte, binigyang diin ni Kaufman na ang prosecution ay hindi nakapagpakita ng sapat at malinaw na ebidensya na direktang nag-uugnay sa dating Pangulo sa mga pinapalabas na krimen. Ang mga testimonya at aligasyon, bagaman may bigat, ay hindi sapat upang labanan ang prinsipyo ng due process. Sa ganitong paraan, ipinapakita ng legal system na ang paghatol ay hindi dapat batay sa emosyon, sa galit ng publiko o sa pressure mula sa media o politika. Ang due process ay hindi lamang tungkol sa proteksyon ng akusado, kundi pati na rin sa pagkakaroon ng patas na pagkakataon para sa parehong panig na ipakita ang kanilang kaso. Sa closing statement, binigyang diin ni Kaufman na ang bawat ebidensya na iniharap ng prosecution ay dapat dumaan sa matibay at maingat na pagsusuri. Dapat suriin kung ito ba ay may kredibilidad, kung may bias ba, at kung ito ba ay sapat upang suportahan ang anumang paratang. Sa pamamagitan ng prosesong ito, nagkakaroon ng balanse sa pagitan ng mga karapatan ng akusado at ang obligasyon ng hukuman na tiyakin na ang hustisya ay naipatutupad. Mahalaga ring tandaan na ang due process ay hindi lamang prinsipyo ng batas ng Pilipinas, kundi isang universal legal principle na kinikilala ng International Criminal Court. Ito ay nagtatakda ng standard na kahit ang pinakamakapangyarihang leader ng isang bansa ay hindi exempted sa tamang proseso. Sa ganitong diwa, ang closing statement ni Kaufman ay nagpapakita ng respeto sa parehong ICC at sa legal framework ng Pilipinas. Ang mensahe ay malinaw. Ang hustisya ay hindi pinipili ng tao o posisyon. Ito ay pinapatupad ayon sa batas at ebidensya. Isa pang mahalagang punto na naipakita sa kanyang pananalita ay ang konsepto ng proportionality at transparency. Ang due process ay nangangahulugan na ang bawat hakbang ng legal na proseso ay dapat malinaw, maayos at maipaliwanag sa publiko. Hindi pwedeng arbitraryo ang hakbangin ng hukuman o ang mga aksyon ng prosecution. Ang transparency ay nagtitiyak na ang publiko, pati na rin ang ibang estado, ay may tiwala sa integridad ng legal proceedings. Dito, ipinapakita na ang pagsunod sa due process ay hindi lamang proteksyon para kay Duterte, kundi isang mensahe rin sa buong mundo na ang ICC ay sumusunod sa prinsipyo ng patas at makatarungang paglilitis. Sa konklusyon, ang keynote na ito ay nagpapakita kung gaano kahalaga ang prinsipyo ng due process sa bawat legal na proseso. Ang closing statement ni Nicolas Kaufman ay isang malinaw na paalala na sa kabila ng political pressure, media narratives at public opinion, ang desisyon ng hukuman ay dapat nakaangkla sa ebidensya, fairness at integridad. Sa bawat hakbang ng pre-trial, ang due process ay nagsisiguro na walang sinuman ang maaagrabyado at ang bawat aksyon ng hukuman ay may basehan sa batas. Ang prinsipyong ito ay hindi lamang legal na obligasyon, kundi moral na tungkulin upang tiyakin na ang hustisya ay tunay na naipatutupad. Ang kahalagahan ng due process ay hindi maaaring maliitin. Ito ang pumipigil sa mga hukuman na maging kasangkapan ng politika. Ito ang nagtitiyak na ang akusado ay may pagkakataong ipagtanggol ang sarili at ito rin ang nagpapakita sa buong mundo na ang hustisya ay hindi pinipili at hindi bias. Sa ganitong paraan, ang closing statement ay hindi lamang pagtatanggol kay Duterte, kundi pagtatanggol ng prinsipyo ng katarungan mismo, na siyang pundasyon ng lahat ng legal na sistema sa mundo. The principle of evidence-based judgment is central to any fair legal proceeding, and in the context of the International Criminal Court pretrial against former President Rodrigo Duterte, it becomes especially critical. Throughout the hearing, the prosecution presented a series of allegations and testimonies intended to implicate the former president in criminal acts. However, as Nicolas Kaufman emphasized in his closing statement, there is a fundamental distinction between allegation and proof, and it is this distinction that forms the cornerstone of Keynote 2, the lack of concrete evidence directly linking Duterte to crimes. Sa isang legal na proseso, ang mga alegasyon lamang ay hindi sapat upang magresulta sa parusa o hatol. The burden of proof lies squarely with the prosecution, and without solid, corroborated, and credible evidence, any claim remains unsubstantiated. In the courtroom, it is easy for narratives to become persuasive. Stories of wrongdoing, emotionally charged testimonies, and dramatic claims can influence perception. Ngunit sa mata ng batas, ang damdamin at impresyon ay hindi dapat maging batayan ng hatol. Nicolas Kaufman, in his closing statement, highlighted that while allegations were abundant, the prosecution has not successfully presented evidence that unequivocally demonstrates President Duterte's personal involvement or intent to commit criminal acts. Every accusation must be scrutinized carefully, and the court must determine whether it is supported by concrete proof or merely speculative narrative. This principle ensures that justice is not compromised by assumption or conjecture. A critical aspect of evaluating evidence is the requirement that it be direct and specific. Sa caso ni Duterte, Kaufman pointed out that the prosecution has relied heavily on general claims about the actions of government officials or law enforcement under the administration. However, the legal standard requires that the accused must be personally responsible for the criminal acts, either by ordering them, participating in them, or knowingly allowing them to happen. Alleging that crimes occurred under a president's administration is not the same as proving that the president himself orchestrated or sanctioned those acts. In other words, there must be a clear line connecting the individual to the act, and without that direct link, the principle of evidence-based judgment dictates that no conclusion of guilt can be drawn. Moreover, credibility and reliability of evidence are essential in any court proceeding. Ang ICC, as an international legal body, upholds the highest standards of judicial review. Testimonies must be corroborated, documents must be authentic, and all evidence must be subjected to rigorous scrutiny. Kaufman emphasized that many of the prosecution's claims lack this level of substantiation. Some testimonies were second-hand accounts, others were emotionally charged but lacked verification, and some documents presented as proof did not conclusively establish Duterte's direct involvement. The absence of reliable evidence highlights the gap between allegations and provable facts, underscoring the necessity for the court to base its decision solely on credible, verifiable proof. It is also important to consider the principle of individual responsibility under international law. The ICC operates under strict guidelines regarding personal culpability. Ang isang leader ay hindi maaaring managot sa mga aksyon ng iba kung walang malinaw na ebidensya na siya mismo ay nag-utos, sumang-ayon o sadyang pinayagan ang mga iligal na aktibidad. Kaufman's closing statement reiterated that while tragedies or crimes may have occurred during Duterte's tenure, there is no evidence that directly implicates him as an instigator or participant. Without clear proof of intentional wrongdoing, the presumption of innocence remains intact, and the court must recognize this fundamental legal standard. Another key point raised in the closing statement is the distinction between policy decisions and criminal intent. Leadership decisions, particularly in matters of public safety and law enforcement, can have wide-ranging consequences. Some of these decisions may result in unintended harm, but it does not automatically equate to criminal liability. Kaufman argued that the prosecution has blurred this line, presenting operational outcomes as if they were direct criminal acts ordered by the president. The court, however, must differentiate between administrative or policy decisions and deliberate criminal conduct. Without evidence demonstrating intent to commit crimes, the allegations remain unproven, and the principle of evidence-based judgment requires that the accused cannot be held guilty solely on the basis of negative outcomes. Furthermore, the burden of proof extends to the requirement of beyond a reasonable doubt. Sa ICC at sa iba pang makatarungang hukuman, ito ay standard na nagpapakita na ang ebidensya na ibinibigay ng prosecution ay dapat sapat upang alisin ang anumang makatwirang duda tungkol sa akusado. Kaufman emphasized that the prosecution has failed to meet this threshold. The materials presented, while detailed in some aspects, do not collectively create a compelling case that establishes Duterte's personal culpability beyond reasonable doubt. This is a crucial point, as it distinguishes between potential wrongdoing and provable criminal responsibility. It is also important to highlight that due process is closely tied to evidence. The legal system is designed to prevent convictions based on emotion, conjecture, or political bias. Kaufman's closing statement underscored that adhering to the principle of evidence-based judgment is not just a procedural requirement, it is a safeguard against miscarriages of justice. If courts were to convict based on allegations alone, it would undermine the very foundation of law and fairness, making every legal proceeding vulnerable to manipulation. Sa ganitong paraan, ang demand for concrete, credible evidence is both a protection for the individual and a preservation of judicial integrity. The closing statement also served as a reminder that justice must be impartial, even in high-profile cases with intense political and public scrutiny. Allegations against prominent leaders often attract attention and debate. But the court's role is not to appease public opinion or media narratives. Kaufman emphasized that the court must remain focused on tangible proof rather than the appearance of guilt. Only by requiring evidence that directly links the accused to the alleged crimes can the ICC fulfill its mandate to deliver fair and just outcomes. In conclusion, the essence of Keynote 2 is the insistence on clear, concrete, and credible evidence as the basis for any judgment. Allegations, no matter how serious or widespread, cannot substitute for verifiable proof. In the case of former President Duterte, Kaufman's closing statement highlighted that the prosecution has not met this essential standard. There is no direct evidence showing that Duterte personally ordered or intended criminal acts. Ang lahat ng presented claims, testimonies at documents ay dapat masuri ng maingat upang tiyakin na ang hatol ng hukuman ay hindi lamang batay sa opinyon o haka-haka, kundi sa matibay at malinaw na ebidensya. This principle safeguards not only the accused, but also the integrity of the ICC itself, ensuring that justice is truly served fairly and impartially. Respect for national sovereignty and the proper use of local legal mechanisms are central themes in discussions surrounding international law, particularly in the context of the International Criminal Court and its proceedings against former President Rodrigo Duterte. Sa kanyang closing statement, Nicolas Kaufman emphasized that while the ICC plays an important role in upholding international justice, it must recognize the authority and capabilities of domestic legal systems. The Philippines, like any sovereign nation, has a functioning legal framework, including courts, oversight bodies, and democratic institutions, which are designed to ensure accountability, transparency, and the rule of law. The principle of sovereignty asserts that the ICC cannot automatically override these national mechanisms. Instead, it must carefully consider whether domestic processes have been exhausted or whether they are capable of addressing allegations fairly and effectively. National sovereignty is more than a legal concept. It is a recognition of a country's right to govern its own affairs without undue interference. Ang Pilipinas, bilang isang malayang bansa, ay may sariling konstitusyon, batas, at sistema ng katarungan. These systems include checks and balances, law enforcement oversight, and judicial procedures meant to hold public officials accountable. Kaufman's argument highlighted that the ICC must respect these frameworks and not assume that international intervention is necessary unless there is clear evidence that domestic avenues are inadequate or compromised. This respects not only the principle of sovereignty, but also the dignity of the people and institutions that have invested in creating a functioning judicial system. One of the key points of this principle is the subsidiarity principle in international law. The ICC operates on the understanding that international prosecution is secondary, meant to intervene only when national courts are unwilling or unable to genuinely investigate and prosecute crimes. Sa caso ni Duterte, Kaufman stressed that the Philippine legal system has mechanisms in place for oversight and accountability. Allegations, while serious, do not automatically warrant bypassing domestic courts, especially when local mechanisms exist that can examine, investigate, and adjudicate claims according to national law. By highlighting the existence of competent domestic processes, the closing statement reinforced that sovereignty must be a guiding principle in determining when and how the ICC exercises jurisdiction. The respect for national sovereignty also ties into the notion of fairness and legitimacy. If international courts act in ways that disregard the legal capacities of the nation involved, it risks creating the perception that justice is being administered selectively or politically. Kaufman emphasized that ICC intervention should not undermine the credibility of domestic institutions, which have the constitutional mandate and societal trust to handle legal matters. The Philippines, through its courts and oversight bodies, has demonstrated the ability to investigate complex matters and to hold officials accountable where evidence exists. Ignoring this fact diminishes the role of local law, potentially eroding public trust in both domestic and international institutions. A crucial aspect of respecting sovereignty is understanding the context in which leadership decisions were made. Governance involves complex decisions that balance law enforcement, public safety, and national stability. Not all decisions, even if they result in controversial outcomes, constitute criminal conduct under international law. Kaufman pointed out that local legal mechanisms are better equipped to understand the societal, political, and cultural context of these decisions. International intervention without proper understanding of local conditions risks misinterpreting policy actions as criminal intent, which would be both unfair and legally unsound. Furthermore, respecting national sovereignty does not mean abandoning accountability. Rather, it underscores the importance of following established domestic procedures before escalating matters internationally. In the Philippines, there are laws, investigative bodies, and legal protocols that ensure that even high-ranking officials are subject to scrutiny. Kaufman's closing statement reminded the court that President Duterte, like any citizen, has rights under domestic law, and the proper avenues for accountability exist within these frameworks. The ICC's role should complement, not replace, domestic legal processes, intervening only when those processes fail or are demonstrably incapable of delivering justice. This approach also safeguards the principle of equality before the law. When a country's legal mechanisms are bypassed without justification, it creates an imbalance in the perception of justice. Kaufman emphasized that the ICC must maintain impartiality and avoid acting as a political actor. Respecting sovereignty ensures that cases are adjudicated based on legal merit rather than international pressure, ensuring that all parties, including the accused, are treated fairly. The closing statement highlighted that President Duterte has cooperated with both domestic and international processes, demonstrating a commitment to legal accountability while asserting the role of Philippine institutions in administering justice. Another important consideration is the efficiency and effectiveness of domestic legal systems. The Philippines has established courts capable of handling complex cases, equipped with legal expertise, investigative tools, and procedural rules that align with international standards. Kaufman argued that these mechanisms can evaluate evidence, question witnesses, and ensure that trials are conducted fairly. Bypassing these mechanisms in favor of immediate international intervention could undermine ongoing investigations and disrupt procedural continuity. By recognizing the competence of local courts, the ICC affirms the legitimacy of national judicial processes while reserving its authority for situations where domestic systems fail to provide genuine justice. Kaufman also emphasized that respecting national sovereignty is a principle that strengthens the international legal order rather than weakening it. The ICC's credibility relies on its careful, judicious application of jurisdiction. If the court were to act without regard for domestic capacities, it risks being perceived as overreaching or selectively enforcing international law. Sa kanyang closing statement, it was made clear that the prosecution's claims do not justify overriding Philippine institutions, and that proper respect for sovereignty ensures that international justice complements rather than competes with national systems. Finally, the closing statement reinforced the idea that sovereignty and accountability are not mutually exclusive. President Duterte's cooperation with the ICC demonstrates that accountability can be pursued internationally without disregarding national legal frameworks. The Philippine legal system remains the primary venue for evaluating the conduct of officials, and international oversight should operate in harmony with domestic processes. Kaufman's argument underscored that recognizing sovereignty does not absolve responsibility. It simply ensures that justice is administered in a manner that is legally sound, contextually informed, and respectful of both national and international legal principles. In conclusion, the respect for national sovereignty and reliance on domestic legal mechanisms is a fundamental principle that must guide the ICC in this pretrial process. Nicolas Kaufman's closing statement highlighted that while international law plays a critical role in ensuring justice, it must operate in a way that respects the authority, competence, and capacity of the Philippine legal system. By acknowledging the effectiveness of local courts and oversight bodies, the ICC not only upholds the principle of sovereignty, but also ensures that justice is administered fairly, transparently, and in accordance with both national and international legal standards. This principle ultimately serves the dual purpose of safeguarding the rights of the accused while reinforcing the credibility and legitimacy of legal processes, both within the Philippines and across the international community.